On May 17, 1899, in the bustling city of San Francisco, Edward Miller Grimm was born. He was a descendant of German ancestors who had come west in the gold rush 50 years earlier. The Grimm family owned a home at 963 14th Street. Ed, as he was called then, was doted on by his 3 older sisters, his older brother, and his mother, Ethel Ava Grimm. His father, Frederick Grimm, was a hard-working engineer who helped design the Oakland streetcar system.
I know his father used to get up very early in the morning, cook his own breakfast, make his lunch, and then walk to the ferry and take the ferry to Oakland. But he was a great philosopher and read everything he could get his hands on.
Watching his father made an impression on young Edward, and years later, he too would become an avid seeker of knowledge. They were not a wealthy family, but they were happy. However, before Ed was 7, he was shaken from his childhood by one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history.
And I don't think any of us ever realized what fear they went through at that time. And you can imagine those huge buildings going up in flames. They couldn't do anything about it. So people were screaming and running and carrying bird cages or whatever they could manage on the streets and running to different places where they felt there was some safety.
The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 resulted in nearly 3,000 deaths, but it took only 2 to devastate young Edward. The quake began at 5:12 in the morning. Frederick Grimm was wide awake and able to secure his own family. Their house was not damaged, and luckily none of them received any injury. After Frederick knew his family was safe, he ran 2.5 miles from their home to check on his aging parents. There, he found his father, fatally injured. A few months later, his mother would also pass away. The Grimm family would never be the same.
Two times a day, the soldiers from the Presidium would bring food for them to cook. Everybody was working, trying to pull themselves together, trying to find a place to live. Their houses were all destroyed. They were trying to rebuild them and fix them so that they would have a home. The city and the people in the city rebuilt everything and really worked. And so I'm sure he saw what you can actually do yourself and how much you can contribute to building a city back.
Ed suffered at the loss of his grandparents, but watching his father struggle to cope was just as difficult. One day, Frederick Grimm wandered off alone. After hours of searching, the family found him in the cemetery, reading tombstones. "All of my friends are here," he said. From that time on, Ed always worked to help support the family. He took any job he could find, checking hats at a club, running errands, cleaning, and delivering groceries.
Every cent that he earned in delivering groceries, he gave to his mother. And that carried on even later in his days. He always sent money to his mother and sisters every month.
As a young man, Ed sought adventure more than affluence. He was a member of the California Alpine Club and went on various organized excursions with the group. He would go swimming and hiking with his friends. They would sing songs as they enjoyed the great outdoors and rode the train up Mount Tamalpais.
People can say what they like about the great open spaces, but I certainly think and feel that we who enjoy getting out in the country lived a wonderful life.
After graduating from high school, Ed got a job working on the piers in San Francisco as an over-short and lost clerk. Then in 1918, as the Allies were pushing back the Germans, Ed and his brother enlisted in the Navy. They joined just in time to see the conflict end and only served 2 months before they were released. At the end of 1918, when the little town of Tooele, Utah welcomed the local boys home from war, Maxine Tate was 4 years old. It was one of her earliest memories. Maxine was the first daughter of Bertha Shields Tate and Joseph Earl Tate. Her father made a meager living as the superintendent of the Tooele Valley Railroad.
She and her brother and sister spent a lot of time on our farm. As good as Maxine was at nearly everything you can think of, she was no horsewoman.
One of them, we had old Dolly. We used to put the children on, and old Dolly was very gentle and very nice and just walked.
He never galloped until Maxine got on him. And he wasn't the only horse that didn't like Maxine. It seemed like she had a little trouble being in command of a horse, where most of the time she was in command of everything.
My grandfather always had the most beautiful garden that ever was. And we as children had a wagon, and he would load the wagon with all these different things, and we would go from house to house. We would take these things to them periodically. And as a result of this, my mother and my father both taught us to take care of people.
Along with this dedication to service, Maxine's mother also instilled in her a love for music.
In those days, as you recall, there was no radio to speak of. And so when we were in the Model T traveling, we were singing all the time. So my mother taught us all these old songs. My mother could play anything on the piano or organ. It was absolutely a delight, and I know she played us to sleep every night. Well, of course, I sort of patterned myself after my mother. I'd go to piano and I'd tinker and play and so forth. And pretty soon I was playing some of the simple things that she was playing.
High school was a promising time for Maxine. She played the piano for school plays and sometimes acted in them. She was an excellent student, intelligent, and always willing to work hard. She had several friends and a steady boyfriend named Veldon Shields, whom everyone called Chub. All seemed to be going well, and the future looked bright. It would come as a serious shock when Maxine's mother experienced severe pains due to gallbladder problems and was rushed to Salt Lake City to be operated on.
My mother was never the same after that. And then it just seemed to grow worse and worse. So finally, we were faced with the fact that she had pernicious anemia.
May 18th, 1932 was Maxine's 18th birthday, and she was speaking at her high school graduation as valedictorian. Her mother was on her deathbed. The doctors had tried everything.
My Aunt Mary went with me to buy my graduation dress. I had problems writing my talk for valedictorian. I was so upset over my mother that I couldn't put my mind on anything else.
But eventually, I satisfied myself and gave my talk to my mother. She lying on her deathbed, but she heard my talk. And then that evening, I went to the auditorium at school, and all the graduates sat on the stage. There were 51 of us. And my father and all the other parents were sitting in the audience. My father was sitting there alone. And as I stood up to give my talk, I thought, I don't think that I will ever be faced with a harder job than this. This is the hardest thing I ever will have to do.
Bertha Tate died 2 weeks later, June 2nd, 1932.
And so I took over the household. My mother had well trained me, of course, and here I am cooking, cleaning, disciplining, helping, doing everything I could. Everything I did reminded me of her, and she wasn't there. And so I had to give myself lectures. I found myself going to the piano or organ more frequently to try and soothe this hurt that was there, because I really missed my mother. This is something that happens to everybody, and eventually I will meet my mother again. And that, as soon as I began to get that feeling that my mother is in a better place and she's not hurting now and she's happy, so you be happy too.
Life was hard, and it took on new meaning. Despite her efforts to fill the role of mother, Maxine never felt she measured up. The year was 1932, and the Tooele Bank was forced to close its doors. The money Joseph Tate had saved from each paycheck for his children was gone, and so were Maxine's plans to serve a mission and go to college. After the Navy, Edward Grimm tried his hand in college, but left after a short time to seek adventure at sea as a crew member on a ship called the Waban.
So he went on this ship and started out. I don't know whether he really knew where he was going or not as he left. And then his life really started changing.
The Waban sailed to Vladivostok, Russia's largest port city. The temperature plunged. Condensation froze, cladding the ship in ice. The men tried in vain to break it up around the bow as ice wrapped around the stern. A mile offshore, they were stuck. Vladivostok would be a wake-up call for 19-year-old Edward Grimm.
Dad said that when he walked into town, that there were bodies stacked like cordwood in the streets. Many of these refugees coming across the railway, fleeing from the Bolsheviks, had died, and the ground, of course, was frozen. There was no way you could bury anybody.
You know, it's hard to imagine, but he did say that if he ever got out of this cold, he would never, never get in the cold again.
Finally, in the spring of 1920, an icebreaker got into the bay, breaking ice 2 feet thick. They followed it out to freedom. The Waban sailed to Shanghai. There, the Admiral Oriental Lines offered Ed a more lucrative job as a shipping agent in the Philippines.
So he said, "Is it hot?" And they said, "All the time." He said, "I'll take it." And so he joined them.
He saw an opportunity that he could succeed in business, so to speak, in a way in the Philippines that he probably never could have if he'd gone back to the States. Now, after I saw Pete operate, Pete would have been successful no matter where he went.
He was just a young man, and that was the beginning of a very exciting life in the Philippines.
He arrived in Manila in June of 1920. The Philippines was a colony only recently Americanized. Every part of the Jazz Age that could be transplanted was. The clubs were the place to be, and Edward Grimm was a favorite at all of them.
He was at some kind of a dinner party, and that Governor General Wood was there, and in some part of the conversation, he was complaining about the piers, the confusion on the piers, and the fact that things weren't getting through.
Pete was soon given a job with Luzon Stevedoring, and within 15 years, he would be the company's owner. Along with his new home and new job, he was also given a new name.
When he got to the Philippines, there was a popular play called The Return of Peter Grimm. You know, when he was the new guy in town, he'd say Grimm, and they'd say, "Oh, you must be Pete."
In business, Pete found that if he gave his day laborers a break and fed them well, they got twice as much work done. His pay was competitive, and he had a clinic and doctor that took care of sick or injured workers. Pete felt that it was important to know and treat his men well. Pete also continued to make friends at the local clubs, lawyers, inventors, businessmen, and American military officials like Douglas MacArthur and Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Pete had begun taking minority positions in businesses where he knew the principals. He was involved in a paper business. He was involved, I think he owned most of the marble company.
And he was strong-willed, and he could get really upset at somebody one day and it would pass. Next day, not an issue. I heard stories, that he'd fire somebody someday, and the next day he'd say, well, where is so-and-so? What? No, he's not supposed to take that seriously, Dad was quite trusting in his business affairs, and he, saw a number of losses situations where he'd trusted the wrong person or hadn't given what would probably have been deemed adequate supervision. And was that his fault for failure to supervise? Or was that his virtue because he gave them the trust and allowed them to do it? I don't know.
But Pete knew what he was doing when it came to the harbors. That's a business that Pete knew better than anybody I've ever met. He understood that, and he was strong. You didn't mess with Pete when it came to the docks.
In the midst of a national and personal Great Depression, when opportunity looked slim, Maxine's father still found the means for her to attend the University of Utah.
And I was able to go to the university because Chubb's father had a law firm in Salt Lake, and he drove to and from Salt Lake to Tooele every day. But I decided I would go into music and drama because I've written a number of plays also, and I figured that would be very easy for me. Well, it was easy for me, but I soon learned that isn't going to make me a lot of money, of course. And so I shifted into business, into textiles, really, so that I could design and make my own and other people's clothes. It could be a business. And then did take some business classes as well. And I took as many classes as they would let me take. And this was a great sacrifice on the part of my family to let me go. And I worked as hard as I possibly could.
As in high school, Maxine excelled at the university. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Textiles and 4 minors: business, music and dramatics, physical education, and French. Her hard work paid off. Maxine received a scholarship to pursue a master's degree at New York University's prestigious School of Retailing.
For me, Maxine, living in small town in Tooele, Utah, and then only going to Salt Lake City, then to go to New York was absolutely the most amazing thing that ever happened. And I was constantly being shown what a hick I really was. Because I remember one day they asked me where I was from, and I always said Utah, hoping they'd know where Utah was. And I remember this one girl said, "Oh, do you commute?" Oh, glory.
Maxine went to class in the mornings. The afternoons were reserved for the students to find work in a local store to go along with their education. Maxine was hired at the luxury department store Lord & Taylor on 5th Avenue.
I remember her making sketches of clothing, designing different things, and telling me what I should wear and what I shouldn't. She was good at that.
Maxine soon began to focus on a specific career path that would suit her talents and interests.
I'd be a buyer, I'd be somebody special. I would go into the market. I could choose my own dresses and coats and shoes, whatever I thought would buy, and I could just see myself really being somebody. Then I got a telephone call. It was from Chubb from Utah, and said, "I am taking the bar exams," and he said, "I want to get married. Come home right now." And I said, "Oh, I can't. I've got too many things on." He said, "You come home right now or else." Well, I knew him well enough to know what he was talking about.
Maxine now faced a big decision. Did she stay in the Big Apple to pursue a career in the fashion retail world? Or did she move back to Utah to start a family with her high school sweetheart? Unsure about what to do, Maxine asked her current employer and trusted friend, Miss May Conroy.
So I went to my dear friend, the buyer of Salt Lake City, who was 50 years old. And she said, I am now 50 years old, and I am working to take care of the rest of my family. And she said, if you have an opportunity to get married, that is more important than a job. You go back to Utah. And I got thinking, I think she knows what she's talking about. So I went back to Utah, and we were married, and that was the smart thing for me to do. It was.
They were married on October 28, 1939. And then tragedy struck.
So now we're married and very happy. We went skiing and everything was fine. And suddenly on my birthday, May 18th, 1940, Bill became very sick. All of a sudden, just tremendous pains.
He was very ill, and it was not long after they were married, maybe 6 months or so, that they didn't have much hope for his recovery.
They didn't know what was wrong, and it was just a downhill thing. And in 7 months of a marriage, he was dead. And it was absolutely devastating. I didn't know how I could handle this. We had a beautiful funeral, buried him in the Tooele cemetery, and then I was totally beside myself.
Belden died on June 7, 1940, very close to the same day Maxine had lost her mother. Maxine returned to New York shortly thereafter. In 1940, while traveling in Guam, Pete started experiencing sharp pains in his stomach. He was diagnosed with bleeding ulcers and was so sick he couldn't be moved for 2 months. He was urged to seek treatment in the United States.
I mean, Dad had bought a sailboat and was going to retire and sail around the world. But he had an ulcer, and at the time, the only treatment they knew for ulcers was surgery. And he went to Leahy Clinic in Boston and had 4/5 of his stomach removed.
During a month of recovery, George Simi, Pete's friend and associate from Manila, showed up with a new Buick he had bought for Pete. When Pete was well enough to leave, they drove to San Francisco. There, Pete rested and reacquainted himself with family and friends. Anxious to get back to the Philippines, Pete arranged for George and himself to fly to Manila on December 1st.
He was staying in a hotel in San Francisco, recuperating, and the man who was a representative to the United States Congress from the Philippines, a man named Bradley Fairchild, saw him, perhaps totally by chance, in the lobby of this hotel. And he said, Peter, I need to be back in the Philippines by the 5th or 6th, 7th of December, and I noticed that you have a reservation on the China Clipper. China Clipper at that time was the only trans-Pacific airline that existed, and at any rate, this man said, let me take your reservation on the China Clipper, and so I can get back to the Philippines, and I can give you my reservation on this Dutch boat.
So they swapped, and Dad was on the ship that sailed out of Pearl Harbor on November 28, 1941.
While still at sea heading for the Philippines, word of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor reached Pete on the Bloemfontein out at sea. As a result, Pete and George's boat was diverted to Australia.
In the meantime, Bradley Fairchild on the China Clipper arrived at the airport in Manila. The airplane and the passengers were immediately taken into the custody of the Japanese, and Bradley Fairchild was placed in a Japanese prison camp.
On December 8th, 1941, I was dragged out of bed by my father in the middle of the night and taken down to listen to a radio broadcast in the kitchen.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced.
So I said, well, is this going to affect our family? And my father said very firmly, yes, it will, and very soon.
It wasn't long after Pearl Harbor that the Philippines felt the advance of the Japanese army. In a matter of days, bombs began to drop, eventually reaching the capital city of Manila.
The bombing continued, so my dad built an air raid shelter outside in the yard, and we stayed in that throughout all of the bombings until the Japanese came in and took over Manila. And then proclamations were issued that you had to give yourself, you had to surrender, give yourself up.
They would come, they'd knock at your door. If you didn't open it right away, they'd break it in, and they'd ask for passports. And so you'd show your passport, and if it was one of these allied countries, they would put you in the truck and off to Santo Tomas.
And the Japanese picked us up and told us they were taking us in to be interrogated, and that we would be gone for 3 days, and we were to bring enough clothing and food to last us 3 days. So we did that, and they took us into Santo Tomas. Santo Tomas was a major university. It was a perfect site for an internment camp.
They packed between 2,500 internees at some periods during the imprisonment, up to 4,000 prisoners. So as you can see, you pretty much kissed privacy goodbye.
Well, going into the camp, initially, as with probably any new move, there's a certain amount of chaos. Everybody's wondering what's going to happen, where you're going to go, what you're going to do as part of your life, and is it going to be a short stay or a long stay? Anticipating or hoping for a short stay, ending up being a long stay.
While in Brisbane, word of Pete's work on the docks in the Philippines reached the ears of the American military leaders. He became an employee of the Navy. In March of 1942, Pete took control of the port at Melbourne.
Peter Grimm, a few weeks later, I suppose, was walking across the lobby of a hotel, and he heard someone call his name. He turned, and it was Jean MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's wife, whom he had known in the Philippines. And in a few minutes, he was talking to the general.
The general, at one point in time, said, Pete, the Army knows how to fight a war down a road, but there's not many roads between here and Tokyo. We need somebody who knows about ships and shipping and stevedoring and loading and unloading, and what are you doing? And Dad's comment was, well, I'm recovering from my illness, and I guess he may have said I'm working for the Navy, I don't know. But the next day, Dad was a colonel in the Army.
And he told him, I'd make you a general, but I'd have to have Congress's approval. Can't do that. So you're on my staff as a colonel, and he put him in charge of all the docks.
It's interesting to contemplate that if Peter Grimm had not changed his tickets and his reservation on the China Clipper for that on that Dutch boat, his life would have been very different. He would have been in the position of Bradley Fairchild, and he would have been in that prison camp himself. Bradley Fairchild undoubtedly would not have been a colonel on General MacArthur's staff. It changed the lives of many people, including the life of Maxine Tate.
Meanwhile in New York, many of Maxine's friends had joined the military. She determined she too wanted to serve.
I knew I had to do something. And all my life, I had patterned my life after doing things for people, and particularly for spreading the gospel. That always was my aim in life. I always wanted to be a missionary, and for some reason never could be. Things always happen. So I thought, that's what I want to do. And then I got looking into American Red Cross. So I put in my papers, And I thought, now I've got to go back to Utah and say goodbye to my family and tell them what I'm doing and so forth.
It was a time of deep contemplation for Maxine. She thought about her past and her future. She hung maps of the world on her ceiling and would lie awake wondering where she would go.
I remember when I received my orders to appear to Washington, D.C., I stood in the window of my aunt's house in Urda, looked out over the valley and thought, what now is going to happen to me? What does life hold for me? Because it had been totally changed. And I thought, there's just nothing left for me in the world, so I will go with the American Red Cross. So when I got on that train to go to Washington, D.C., the landscape was whizzing by. I was thinking, what really is in store for me? Am I prepared for what is going to happen?
From Washington, D.C., Maxine went to South Carolina for training and then awaited her orders.
And I had it all figured out in my mind that I was going to the European theater because I spoke French, perfectly logical. But the train started going west, and it should be going north, and I couldn't figure this one out. And pretty soon I knew we were headed for the Japanese theater, not for Europe by any matter of means. And that was a terrific disappointment to me, but of course, I'm in the Army now. I do what they say.
On the other side of the world, Colonel Pete Grimm had been called to active duty and was assigned with the Quartermaster Corps. Pete did essentially what he had done before he was in uniform, manage the ports and move the supplies.
And he made comments that the ships were coming into the ports in Australia, and he says the guns were on the bottom and the candy bars were on the top. He says, how could you send a ship into a war situation without the stuff you needed where you needed it?
He was not a person that wanted to talk. He wanted to get things done.
By the time Pete was transferred to Adelaide, a month after his appointment, he had already made his mark.
My dear Colonel, your transfer is deeply regretted. Your enthusiasm, unusual ability to get things done, your knack of making friends has made you a figure that cannot be replaced in this organization. Very sincerely yours, Colonel Jeffrey Galway.
From Adelaide, he went to Perth, then back to Melbourne, then to Brisbane, then Sydney. Whenever he left, he was missed. Wherever he went, he was wanted somewhere else. In January of 1943, the Allies defeated the Japanese at Sanananda and took Buna on New Guinea. On February 4th, Pete was transferred to head the Transportation Corps. He was ordered to New Guinea. Early in 1943, Colonel Hanford McNider and Colonel Grimm set up advanced headquarters in Milne Bay, New Guinea. They lived in an old oil tanker and were under frequent attack by the Japanese. At the same time, 52 nurses and 3 Red Cross women, including Maxine, boarded a boat in California and sailed for Milne Bay, New Guinea. Maxine had chosen to train in recreational hospital service, so it was her job to keep the servicemen and women sane and out of trouble while at sea. She organized everything from contests and games to shows with singers, dancers, and comedians.
You know, when you've changed your life by your own decision, you often wonder, did I make a right choice? And one night I remember vividly standing there, tears streaming down my face, saying, Heavenly Father, have I really made the right choice? Can you really help me to see how I can do good? That's what I wanted. That's all I wanted, was to do good, to spread the gospel. But you know, as I stood there and the churning of the boat, the waves were slapping against the side of the boat, and it was sort of soothing to me. A calm came over me, and I knew that what I was doing was right. I was on the right road. There was many things that I could do, that my future was ahead of me, and I had this very calm feeling come over me, which carried me into the Philippines, fortunately. Then this wonderful, wonderful day came when we pulled into a harbor with palm trees and banana trees all around on the shore, this total jungle area, this beautiful expanse of water here. Here we are in Milne Bay, New Guinea.
It was here in the Pacific that Maxine's talents and compassion would come together. The love for music and her desire to care for her fellow man that her parents instilled in her would come to bless the lives of those she served.
In the hospital, we had a Ward 13, and this was really the psychiatric ward where you didn't know what to do with the person. There was something wrong, they couldn't talk, they couldn't move, or they were crying all the time, or they were fighting or something. A very sad-looking situation. And I didn't like this, and I wanted to do something about it. But the doctor said, there's no cure, nothing you can do, absolutely nothing you can do. But I knew that there was something that I could do. So I had my old Army field organ that I had acquired in New Guinea. I took that in this ward every evening and played and sang. But I particularly was conscious about this one very nice young boy who was totally immobile. And I'd say, look, come on, John, just listen to me, and I'm going to sing a song for you, and he'd sing. And I watched him very closely, and pretty soon I saw just a little bit of movement, and I thought, aha, I'm getting him. Oh, music is what he needs. Music is the thing. Well, within 2 weeks, he was talking and was normal and told me that he was a guitar player and he loved music. So then I knew music is healing. Music can perform miracles.
Maxine's talents would bless the lives of countless servicemen and women in many ways.
First, when I landed in New Guinea, I contacted the chaplains to find out if there were any LDS, and I found out that they had one group that was meeting on a ship. We didn't really honestly realize how much we missed the church until we didn't have it and couldn't have it. But then, when I was able to meet and actually take the sacrament, what a wonderful thing.
Maxine helped organize the first church meetings and always provided the music on her well-traveled Army field organ.
I had been told in my patriarchal blessing I would do great good with my music, and I felt that I needed to use my music whenever possible. Well, this organ made it possible.
Whenever there is a meeting among the military members in the military, she naturally will be around there to play the organ, you know, with her pump organ. It's a small, beautiful little pump organ.
But I arrived in New Guinea in the spring of 1944, and there I met with the LDS group that were already organized, holding services, and that's when I became acquainted with Maxine Tate, who was our organist, and I might say a lovely contribution to our group. She was instrumental in helping us, not only spiritually, but socially. Because of her contacts, she was able to make available to us things that we normally couldn't do by ourselves. She had that ability.
At the end of 1943, the American government arranged for the release of several American citizens from the Japanese. Some were from Santo Tomas, where Pete's friends were.
It will be interesting to find out from these people how the Japs are actually treating the people in the internment camp. I note from the list available in this end of the world, very few people from the Philippines were let out. To me, that is a very bad sign, and indicates the Japs are deliberately holding most of the people as hostages. Colonel Grimm to Judge, 17th of December, 1943.
Along with all others in Santo Tomas, Pete's friends and employees were hostages. Food was scarce, and they were desperate to find ways to supplement their diets.
As you become increasingly hungry, why your focus is really well oriented toward food. How do I get more food? Where do I find more food? How can I steal more food?
I remember as time went on, scrounging from garbage cans, rusty 55-gallon drums for food. I mean, anything. If it was covered with blowflies, you flicked the flies off, and you took the food and you ate it, sometimes with a little bit of rust in it, maybe with a little gravel on it, but you still ate it.
But the thing that really got me was to watch my sister and brother cry in the morning because they were hungry. And it wasn't until I was a mother myself that I realized how difficult it was for my mother to go through that.
General Douglas MacArthur's flight from the Philippines in March of 1942 represented an early and disheartening setback in the American war effort. Returning would be difficult, but it was essential. Before he could retake the Philippines, MacArthur needed to stop the Japanese from using New Guinea as an invasion spot for Australia. After successfully isolating the Japanese there, he initiated his island hopping campaign, in which he attacked and defeated islands across the Southwest Pacific, cutting off the enemy forces and moving the front ever closer to Japan. In 1944, after 2 years of intense fighting, MacArthur was given permission to begin the recapture of the Philippines. The initial landing site would be Leyte. Regaining the airstrip in Tacloban, Leyte's capital city, would give the American air fleet the ability to attack at the main island of Luzon. The prisoners at Santo Tomas hopefully awaited their liberation. On October 20th, 1944, General MacArthur, along with Colonel Grimm, landed with troops on the Philippine island of Leyte.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated in the blood of our two people. We have come dedicated and committed to the task of destroying every vestige of enemy control over your daily lives and of restoring upon a foundation of indestructible strength the liberties of your people.
In Tacloban, Pete was the port commander. It was his responsibility to get the men and the supplies ashore from the ships. Accustomed to a life of luxury, Pete soon set up living quarters in the Walter Price mansion, where he slept across 2 chairs because the place had long since been ransacked. Later, MacArthur adopted the mansion as his own headquarters, and Pete was relocated. This was not the only relocation that was taking place. Despite the tumultuous seas that threatened to stop them, Maxine and her hospital unit landed in Leyte. Because hospitals were not yet set up, Maxine sought out the Red Cross supervisor.
I found a way into Tacloban and found the Red Cross man, and he said that he had orders to find quarters for some Red Cross that were going to come eventually to Tacloban, and maybe I could find some quarters.
I found a compound of 3 houses, but no furniture. I was told that the furniture was under the house, where Colonel Grimm and Major Kavanagh were living. Well, I knew Kavanagh, so I called him, and he said yes, there was furniture underneath the house and to come over. I easily found a GI to take me and walked under the house and saw the furniture and walked up the back stairs. And there stood a very handsome colonel with spotless uniform and shiny boots.
And there was that Pete Grimm that I'd been hearing about I've been hearing tales about Pete Grimm in the Philippines. Here he was. And he said, why don't you come and have chow with us?
I was appalled at the attire of the rest of the officers. The rest were partially clad, so they all put on shirts and made themselves presentable, because an American girl was a special treat.
But anyway, they took me home, and we had a nice visit, and he said, I'll get in touch with you. And I thought, oh, how can he do this in the middle of the war? And bombs going off, you could hear them even then dropping in different places. So I thought, this is going to be really something.
Despite the madness of the war that surrounded them, Pete and Maxine managed to see one another. On one occasion, Maxine found the opportunity to share her musical talent with Pete.
I found a piano, if you can believe it. And so I decided, okay, I'll play. So I played my favorite piece, Liebesstraum, which is really a love song, actually. And I remember he's sitting in the window and I'm playing this on the piano. And I think I really touched something in that heart of his. After I had played that piece for him on the piano, that had always been his favorite piece, and it has always been mine. Always brings back memories when I play that piece, because that was really the beginning of a very, very deep friendship and love that was there.
It's remarkable that these two individuals could come together and fall in love. Pete was from the big city of San Francisco. Maxine was from the small town of Tooele, Utah. When they met, Pete was not religious. Maxine was a devout Mormon. He was the youngest child, she was the oldest, and a list of things that might have kept them apart goes on, including a 15-year age gap. It was miraculous that they got along so well, but they found each other and formed a bond. As the war trudged on, the already bad situation in the Philippines at Santo Tomas was steadily getting worse. Internees were struggling to meet even the basic needs for survival.
A 200-pound man might have been reduced to 75 pounds in weight by the time, by the end of December of 1944, and people were dying from starvation.
I mean, people sat down and died. I mean, that was it. You just sit down and suddenly you're dead. You never knew who it was going to happen to.
We also realized, even the children realized, that we might be killed before we were rescued.
In one way, everybody shared the problem. So in that way, as long as other people are in the same boat, you feel somewhat reinforced. But the main thing that drove us, kept us alive, was hope. One day.
Just as the skies seemed to darken with despair, a light appeared in the distance that drew closer and turned into an explosion.
That was our clue, that they were here and they were close by. That was the preamble of liberation.
American planes flew over and dropped leaflets in the camp area. And the Japanese were running all over, shouting and screaming at us, to keep away, don't pick him up. But the leaflets said that we are Americans, we have not forgotten you, and we are coming back soon. That's what it was. Now, that was the first inkling that I even had an idea, maybe the war was ending. Maybe we are going to get out of here.
They were bombing in the early evening, and it virtually blocked out the sun. Nighttime came, and there was clouds overhead, and the whole city was aglow, a red glow.
And we were all cheering, and it just seemed like the Japanese fighters that were coming up to attack the American dive bombers that were attacking were just helpless against them, that they were so outclassed by the American aircraft, and that gave us a huge lift.
But we were absolutely thrilled that rescue was a realistic thought.
On January 9th, 1945, the 6th Army, led by General Walter Kruger, landed its first units on the western coast of Luzon, near Manila. On January 31st, General MacArthur arrived at the 1st Cavalry Division headquarters at Guimba. There, he gave orders for an immediate campaign that would go down as one of the gutsiest military actions in American history.
And then the word started spreading that there was talk about, because the U.S. forces were getting very, very close, there was talk about digging trenches and annihilating most of us and burying them in the trenches so there wouldn't be any evidence.
There was a need to move quickly. When resistance was encountered, the troops were to charge through it. Large and lengthy battles were to be avoided. The 100-mile dash through enemy-infested territory was made by what was called the flying column. The troops did as they were commanded, pushing through multiple attacks and ambushes. They were 66 hours into the mission when at about 8:50 p.m. on February 3rd, an American tank crashed through the front gate of Santo Tomas.
We started hearing this droning in the distance, and it sounded like a bunch of bombers coming over. The way they started, you could hear them starting, and then they'd get louder and louder.
We started to hear gunfire outside. There was just rifle fire. And then it started to get dark, and then we heard a rumble. And we guessed probably tanks. We didn't know if the Japanese or American.
As we were sitting there, we heard screaming. And we didn't know what it was. It was so far distance we couldn't hear what the screaming was about. But the noise, the screams, were being carried up the stairways and through the hallways and just repeated by group after group after group until the relay of sound got close enough to us that we could hear what they were saying. And they were shouting, "They're here! They're here!"
Ran back and told my dad. I said, well, I ran all the way back and said, well, they're here. And he says, who's here? And I said, the Americans are here. And it was still like, what? You can't believe it. It's hard because when you've had 3 years of not eating and living on hope and prayer, a lot of prayer, that when the moment does come, you're not ready.
My mother said she was in a panic like everybody else. She was running down one of the streets and this tank stopped in front of her. And she saw a hatch and she saw a helmet come up and she said, oh my God, this is my last moment on earth. I'm going to be killed. And she said, instead she heard in a strong Southern accent, he says, lady, would you move your blankety blank ass? He says, we're trying to fight a blankety blank war. And she said, if she lived to be 1,000, those were the most beautiful words she ever heard, because she wanted to just hug the guy.
Liberation was the high point of my life. There's nothing that can come to it. It's so much, it's unbelievable hope coming true, something that you never knew it was going to come. You never knew that it was ever going to occur. But when it occurred, it was such an unbelievable feeling. I screamed, and the rest of us screamed a whole night and screamed for joy. And I can just tell you, it was extreme emotional release, just extreme.
On February 4th, 1945, Colonel Pete Grimm flew to the Lingayen Gulf and took a jeep to Santo Tomas to take command.
After Colonel Grimm went into Santo Tomas, I met some of his friends who came back, and they told me that the people there just received him like a god because they knew him before, of course, and all these prisoners, American prisoners, knew him, and some of them had worked for him. And so they were asking him, oh, where's my family? What's happened to this? What's happened to that? Of course, he'd been in the war, and he didn't know anything about it either.
One of the first things after the troops burst in on the second floor of the main building, they unfurled the American flag, which was emblematic of they've returned. We're liberated. We're here.
On February 7th, 1945, General MacArthur visited Santo Tomas. The large group that had gathered cheered and pushed forward in hopes of shaking the man's hand. His visit was brief, no more than a half hour, but he made it a point to greet his old friends including Colonel Grimm. On the same day, Japanese troops in Manila began shelling Santo Tomas, killing 23 and wounding 39.
Japanese opened up on our camp point blank with their anti-aircraft batteries from about 1,000 yards away. And they were just blowing the daylights out of the camp.
Manila was burning, and it was like a huge torch. The Japanese had blown up all of the area that around the docks and the port and the ammunition dumps and so forth, and so you had this backdrop of a flaming city.
The city of Manila was the second most destroyed city in the entire World War II. Warsaw was number 1, and the Philippines was number 2.
A letter written by Pete to a friend dated April 6, 1945, described the aftermath of Manila.
As you probably anticipated, I arrived back in the islands with the first troops and have been busier than a bird dog ever since, trying to do what I could for our many friends. In brief, Manila is a complete wreck. The destruction was carried out by masters and is something that is going to take years to repair.
The situation in Santo Tomas presented Colonel Grimm with a seemingly impossible task. The emaciated internees were sick with dysentery from the army rations they were given. The Japanese had cut off the camp's water line, leaving them with nothing to drink or flush toilets with, and the few nurses in the camp were doing all they could without facilities and supplies. Pete called in some of his stevedores to help clean up, and servicemen and women were called in to assist as well.
Then a very exciting thing happened to me. The Red Cross received an order asking Red Cross workers to assist with the American prisoners at Santo Tomas, and my name was listed. We were to report to Colonel Grimm, and the order was signed by General MacArthur. I can tell you that there was more than a stir around. Why was my name the only one listed?
Pete had requested help from the Red Cross and specified her name on the order. She came immediately to assist the hundreds of internees.
As I went in, I had all my camera equipment because I had been taking movies all the way from New Guinea, and I could not take one single picture. There was just something so sacred about this whole thing. The feeling was so intense that I just couldn't take a picture. And then I saw this long line of people, and so I followed the line of the people and got to the very end, and there sat Colonel Grimm at a desk.
With the battle continuing outside of the gates, it was Colonel Grimm's duty to protect the internees and organize all of the camp affairs until transportation to America was available. Pete helped several of the men return to work. Engineers and past employees of Pete's were given jobs clearing and repairing the streets and waterfronts. Several Americans who had worked for Luzon stevedoring chose to stay and help rebuild the war-torn Manila rather than return to the United States.
My experiences in Santo Tomas were really beyond expression. Actually, they were so deep, emotionally very deep, to see all these people who had been there over 3 years and no outside communication, and now they were in the very ends of any clothes that they had to wear. And so I became very aware of their needs. I had brought some things with me and used everything that I had, cosmetic-wise or creams or so forth. And then I realized there were just so much more that had to be done.
The continuing destruction of the city put more and more people without basic necessities. Now there was a constant stream of refugees trying to get into Santo Tomas for security, but there was no room and not enough supplies. Pete and Maxine went scouting the remains of the city and found San Beda, a Catholic school that had served as Japanese financial headquarters during the occupation.
I took over. We put someone at the gate of Santo Tomas to tell everyone to come to San Beda. As they came, we cleaned and fixed, and I found a card file and registered everyone who arrived. I figured there were about 1,000 people there all the time, but they were coming and going.
it was such a hodgepodge of humanity and people moving in, babies crying. We had babies born, we had babies die, we had sick people, we had everything you can imagine, and yet I found nurses and doctors, Filipinos, amongst the refugees themselves. So they were able to help set up, and we set up a regular clinic and a hospital.
When a Red Cross supervisor visited San Beda and saw what Maxine had undertaken, he told her that the Red Cross was in no situation to handle it and needed to pull out. Maxine was sent to meet with the Red Cross's head nurse.
We had this interview, and I remember her asking, she said, well, I don't know what to do with you. I don't know whether to send you home or to put you in charge. And I said, well, that's your problem. So she put me in charge, which was really funny. And she put me in charge of all the hospitals. So from then on, I had an office and a secretary, and boy, did I get things done.
San Beda stayed open to serve. A lot of the men that had arrived there had worked for Pete before the war, and so he was able to send them with George Simi to get their company started again. The company was in shambles from the war, and there was much work to be done. Pete had received word that the Japanese had seized his home during the occupation. He decided to return to the house in an effort to reclaim it. The Japanese officers who had occupied the house had painted the windows and wooden floors black, spiked all the trees, and converted the swimming pool into an air raid shelter. Pete moved in and began making repairs. On top of Maxine's responsibilities at the hospital, she had a desire to start organizing LDS church services. She found 3 fellow Latter-day Saints in the camp, and Pete offered his home as a meeting place.
I often reflect upon the wonderful feeling that we had at this first meeting. For some of us, it had been a long time since we had had the sacrament. And here we were able to have the sacrament because we had 2 elders. So one blessed the sacrament and Ole passed it. And what a wonderful feeling.
I remember playing on my Army field organ and tears splashing down on the keys until I could hardly play. Come, Come Ye Saints was always our favorite hymn, and this usually brought back vivid memories of times past, besides pointing out the real trek we were on. We were pioneers in a different way. It was the beginning, the first church held in Manila. It was March 11th, 1945. The next Sunday, we had at least 10 GIs, and from then on, it grew in leaps and bounds.
That was the church experience that these men had. Many of them would attend church and then become casualties of war. Many of them would have fought battles the day before and come to church on Sunday. And her experiences, the things that she caused to happen, saved lives. And she continued that experience as the gospel was opened to the Philippines. Extraordinary lady.
As the church became more organized, the members started all kinds of projects and activities. Ice cream socials at Pete's house, dances in the city, and craft making in the hospitals. With Maxine in charge and Pete's constant willingness to help, progress was made. Pete was also very busy with administrative duties in Santo Tomas, finding people work, approving passes, and sorting out financial debt. So his time with Maxine was limited.
On one occasion, Colonel Grimm and I were walking down to the administration building, and he was smoking a cigar. I mentioned that I hated smoking, and especially cigars. He stopped and looked at me and said, "Do you really mean that?" I said, "Yes, I do." With that, he took his cigar and threw it into a GI trash drum and said, "I will never smoke again," and he never did.
Pete was a man of his word. In Tacloban, he had promised to give Maxine a boat ride, and he made it a point to keep that promise.
I thought, that is impossible to do in the middle of a war and bombs dropping all over you. And yet, there I was, meeting him, and we did this boat ride. Very pleasant and I thought, this is a very special colonel. He is different is different from the GIs and the other colonels that I had known. There was something very special about him. And I think he must have had a feeling also, well, I'm sure he did, or he wouldn't have followed up in getting the special orders for me to come and be with him.
Pete and Maxine grew closer as they walked, talked, and took jeep rides to survey the war-torn Manila.
Dad said that when he and Mother were in Santo Tomas prison camp, it's a large building and had a tower on top with a little walkway around the tower. And he said he and Mother would walk around that tower and look at the city.
We would watch the most spectacular fireworks that you ever could see. Star shells would hang suspended in the sky and light up the city. Explosions sent fragments flying into the air. The noise was deafening, not only from explosions, but from the guns shooting huge shells swishing overhead. It was hard for me to comprehend the tremendous destruction that was taking place.
How terrible. And I thought, and I said that to him, how terrible. And he said, oh, well, we'll just build it up again. And I thought, how can you do that? And he said, it's just water under the bridge. It's spilt milk. You can't do anything about it. You just build again. And then I thought of so many things that I had lost in my life, you know, and I was kind of moaning, I guess, feeling in a bad mood. And he kept saying, you can't live in the past. You've got to live in the future. Take advantage of everything that's happened and build from there on.
With battles ceasing and a more stable American control in Manila, transportation was now safe for the internees, and most left the camps.
There was still constant talk of the coming invasion of Japan. I was busy helping to train and prepare everyone for the many casualties we expected in our hospitals. They stated that we would have at least 1 million injured. That figure chilled me through and through. Then came the exciting evening in August 1945. Colonel Grimm and I were sitting in the window talking about the future and what might happen to us. And suddenly it sounded as if the Japanese had suddenly attacked Manila. There were guns, rockets, and noises of all kinds. It was a terrifying moment. And then everyone was shouting, "The war is over! The war is over!" We could hardly believe such good news, for we had been anticipating the landing in Japan and knew that it would be a great loss of life. We could hardly contain our great joy. Suddenly life took on a new meaning. We were still alive and could plan our future.
In Japan, the industry had been destroyed, and General MacArthur worked hard to help the country back on its feet. MacArthur recognized the emperor, helped set the value of the yen to the dollar, and sent for experts in different fields to come and rebuild. Military personnel were also needed. Pete was sent to Japan to open the ports and take charge of all transportation. Maxine anxiously awaited and finally received her own orders. She was to report to Kyoto, Japan, where she would be recreation director of all hospitals.
And in Kyoto, I had a very nice secretary and everything set up so that I could plan my whole program and go on and do whatever I felt was necessary for the good of the troops in the hospital.
My office was in the Red Cross headquarters. I had to make contact with all of the hospitals to determine the skill level of their recreation workers, as well as to find out what equipment they had and what their needs were. I would visit hospitals to deliver needed supplies and to give lectures and demonstrations to the workers and patients. However, the patients were now different. Before we had battle casualties, and now we had accident cases, sicknesses, and then dependents and civilians. The feeling was not the same.
During Maxine's stay in Japan, she would become very close to the people.
I'd learned the culture of the Japanese. Their dancing, their singing, their different shows that they put on and so forth and so on. And I became such close friends with them that we followed afterwards for many years.
It was a strange thing. We'd been told to hate and kill the Japanese, and we talked that way. They killed many of my buddies and friends. They turned my life topsy-turvy, and yet, now that we had buried the hatchet, we were great friends. No malice, no hate, no feeling of revenge. Why did we have to kill in the first place?
One day, you are bitter, bitter enemies, and the next day, you're just the sweetest, closest friends that ever can be.
Pete knew a lot of the Japanese men he found at the ports, and he found them very organized. He simply told them to go to work and everything went smoothly. Feeling unnecessary and wanting to return to the Philippines to rehabilitate Luzon stevedoring, Pete requested to be released from the army. In Japan, he would only see Maxine once.
I met up with Pete and we went sailing on Lake Hakone. Pete had always told me what a great sailor he was, and I believed him until he tipped the sailboat over. There was no dangers, we could both swim, and the Japanese soon saved us, but Pete lost one of his shoes. In later years, whenever Pete had a tendency to brag, I would remind him of this trip.
Pete's discharge request was approved. The military was going to work with his company. As stated in a letter written the 6th of September 1945, Pete was to be principal contractor for the Americans, handling all the cargo arriving in the Philippines. Maxine was also set up for a change in scenery.
The day came when I was asked if I would like to transfer to the Public Relations Department. I had become disenchanted with the hospital program. More dependents were coming, and I could see that there would be more challenges in public relations.
Maxine happily accepted the transfer. Her first project was to design a modern hospital. She held a contest where anyone could submit designs.
In time, I was given 1 month's leave to go home. I left in 1946 and traveled by military plane at no cost. When I arrived, it was a big shock to find such luxury cars and stores full of everything. I was happy to find our Tooele ranch was in good shape. Nearby, my brother had an airplane school, and so, to pass the time, I decided to get my pilot's license.
As she had in all her undertakings, Maxine excelled at flight school. She soon came to prepare for her final assignment, the solo flight. But her plans were interrupted by a phone call.
And I said, hello, and it was Pete Grimm in the Philippine Islands calling me. And he said, what are you doing? Well, I was so excited over the fact that tomorrow I'm taking my solo that I told him. And he said, what? You're taking your solo? And I said, yes, isn't that exciting? And he said, I want you to promise me you will not take your solo tomorrow. And I said, what? I'm already there.
It did not take long for me to realize that he meant what he said. I said with great misgivings that I would not go. I learned why he didn't want me to take the risk when he proposed marriage. Should I marry him? He was not a Mormon. He had stopped smoking, but still drank on occasion. He was extremely intelligent, thinking far ahead of those around him. He was handsome and kind, with a keen sense of humor. I knew life would always be challenging and fascinating with him. I told him I had to consider it.
In time, Maxine did accept Pete's marriage proposal, but she was in no hurry. She returned to Japan and was enjoying a new job. She had big plans and had arranged to go to Korea, even though most considered it the Siberia of the armed forces. But one day, Maxine received another unexpected call from Pete.
I remember so well that telephone call from the Philippines about when we would be married and the plan and so forth and so on. And I said, oh, I can't go yet because I have this assignment to go to Korea. And I've always wanted to go to Korea. And I'll just take that, it'll maybe be a couple of months or so, that's okay. And he said, I will take you to Korea. Don't worry about that. Let's get married right away.
Maxine put in her papers of resignation. This took some time, but the day finally arrived. She traveled by military plane to California. Pete met her there, and they drove to Erta, Utah.
My family was fascinated with Pete. He could charm anyone. We were married on Mom and Dad's wedding anniversary on the 25th of June, 1947.
We were married in my aunt's house, which is still standing, and all my relatives were there.
I remember how Maxine looked beautiful, and we met Pete, and that was the first time we had met him, and he was very impressive.
Well, you could tell by the way they looked at each other that they cared for each other, and that was good.
Very different upbringing, very different lives, very different experiences, and yet something in their core, their goodness, their appreciation of things that mattered most, brought them together like two magnets, and they did find happiness. In my mind, Heavenly Father brought Maxine and Pete together. Somehow in their planning meetings up there, they decided that this would be a wonderful companionship, and it absolutely was.
We were on our way. Again, I left this wonderful home, not knowing what was to be in store for me. I had no qualms or fears, just great anticipation and excitement. However, no amount of imagination could have predicted my future. We were both in love with each other and with life. We planned great things and had plenty of time to talk as we embarked on our honeymoon and made our way to New York.
The Grimms' honeymoon would continue on to England, Scotland, Istanbul, and Calcutta, then on to Thailand and Hong Kong, where Pete had offices and business to attend to, leaving Maxine to shop and sightsee. It was immediately apparent that life for this Tooele native would never be the same.
All of a sudden, I discovered that this man, my husband, said, "Dear, you can have anything that you want. Don't worry about that. Don't worry about this. Get that. If you'd like it, get it." And I thought, oh, I can't really do this. So he sort of prodded me on and pushed me on. And all of a sudden, I thought, wow, I'm like a queen. And then I discovered when we got in the Philippines, I had a car and a chauffeur.
They had enough money that they could do probably almost anything they wanted. But they never ever acted hoo-ha. They never ever made themselves better than, or they were so generous in their giving. They were so helpful.
I found out that my husband could do anything better than anybody else. I was quilting, if you can believe it, and he said, "Oh, why don't you do it this way?" And showed me a faster way to quilt. It was just a genius at making things. He could paint, he could sketch, he could mold things, he could build. I learned later he can build houses or buildings or you name it, whatever. So I just married a miracle man, you might say, and I had a hard time trying to keep up with him.
Pete wanted to succeed in anything he did, and he made sure his actions benefited the Philippines. By rebuilding his own business, he was able to help improve the country's economy, and with Maxine's help, Pete's business became more service-oriented. Pete was successful because he was aware, and he always jumped at new opportunities. There were always people trying to get money from Pete for projects and ideas. He became infamous for only helping those he felt were desirous of helping others. On one occasion, a man visited Pete's office and asked for money. They had a long conversation before Pete denied the loan.
Somebody asked him how it went, and he said, "Well, it was going okay until I asked him what this would do for the Filipinos, how this would bless their lives." And he didn't have an answer, so he didn't get the loan. And everything he did, he wanted to lift and bless the people of the Philippines, or whatever country he was working in. He wasn't there to exploit like so many people, take the money and run. He was there to help people help themselves and each other.
Because of Pete's work, the Grimms were constantly traveling, setting up businesses, and finding new opportunities. At times, they would be away for 3 to 6 months. They had homes in several countries and even built a home in Tooele. On one special trip to Utah, Maxine discovered she was pregnant. Pete and Maxine agreed that they wanted their child born in the States.
I was in my great-grandpa Lee's home on a very snowy November 20th, 1951, when I had a beautiful baby boy. It's impossible to write the joy I felt. Pete was so proud of him, and of course, we named him Edward Miller Grimm II. Back in the Philippines, it was such a joy to have this happy and healthy baby in our home. We made so many plans for him, and then we discovered I was pregnant again. It was important to me that this baby be born in the United States, so I returned to Tooele. I remember telling Dr. Milburn I wanted a girl. On February 28th, 1953, my daughter Linda was born.
Their children saw a lot of the world at a young age. When in the Philippines, Maxine taught them the importance of independence and hard work. As they grew older, Linda and Pete Jr. were given tutors to help them in their education.
She tried to get us to do things for ourselves because most of the society in the Philippines at the time was fairly well pampered and taken care of. We'd go on trips to factories. Mother would take us to the match factory, you know. She'd take us to this factory and that factory, and we'd had all kinds of these educational experiences that were fun. And then you get to Tooele Elementary School and suddenly you have to write a report for Mrs. Merrill or Miss Dodge, you know, and gee, it was kind of traumatic.
During all her time in the Philippines, Maxine did her best to spread the gospel to everyone around her. As her children grew and as she lived amongst the Filipinos, she had an increased hope of seeing the church established in the Philippines. Knowing how important it was to his wife, Pete stepped forward to help.
Her avocation was to have the church grow in the Philippines. And he loved her enough and he respected her enough that though he wasn't a member of the church, he acceded to her desires, knew that it was a good thing, and supported her.
I had asked President McKay if we couldn't have some missionaries come, but here is the other interesting thing about having a non-Mormon, as my husband was, because he knew everybody in the Philippines.
With the help and persistence of Pete Grimm, visas were obtained and permission for the church to enter the Philippines was given. On May 28, 1961, Elder Gordon B. Hinckley officially initiated missionary work in the Philippines.
When the missionaries started out, 2 went to the right and 2 went to the left, and that was the beginning of missionary service.
On June 6, 1961, 4 missionaries arrived, ready to preach the gospel.
One of the great traditions of the mission was Maxine and Pete Grimm.
They were the mom and dad of all the missionaries. Our mission president was located in Hong Kong, and they took care of us.
They were in the right place at the right time. Brother Grimm had sufficient funds and sufficient notoriety, sufficient contacts in government.
They viewed their job as making our job easier, so whatever they could do, they did. They opened their home, and we actually used to have sacrament meeting in their home on Sundays, and they had a relic of a swimming pool, and we used to have the first baptisms in their yard.
If my husband had had the blueprints of a baptismal font, he couldn't have done a better job. Everything was there, the right depth, the steps, the railing, the pond to wipe your feet, everything was there.
The first 2,000 members of the church were baptized in our swimming pool. That was the place for baptisms. And so every Saturday afternoon, we pretty much knew that the downstairs part of the house was reserved for church meetings.
The Grimms soon became the mission parents to all the missionaries away from home. Maxine cared for them like a mother.
She loved the missionaries, made sure that we were happy, made sure that we were entertained, made sure that we had clean apartments, that we met the standards that were required to be healthy. Sister Grimm is probably one of the elect ladies of the church, and Brother Grimm was right there with her.
The missionaries affectionately called Pete Grimpaw. He took the time to teach them life skills and to help them understand the Filipino culture.
He was a great motivator, and he liked to, I think he liked to mentor the young missionaries. He liked having them around. He was very proud of the missionaries, and they were good, they were good company to him, and he would show us off.
But to have Grandpa just pull us aside, now what do you hear from your family? Is everything okay at home? And just so concerned that we were all right.
In the beginning, church attendance consisted of some Americans from the embassy, some members of the military, and the missionaries. Before long, there were more and more members, and a new and larger meeting place was needed. Pete Grimm used his influence and expertise to help locate the land for the first chapel.
He didn't ever want credit. He didn't ever want a chapel named after him or a building or whatever. But he was tireless in his work for the church, which was fascinating to me since he wasn't yet a member.
And we just really got so excited about the building of the church that it just kept going and going and going, and my stories are just tremendous until look how many. Oh, over 600,000. It's unbelievable. But the Filipinos were ready for the gospel of Jesus Christ.
In 1961, Douglas MacArthur revisited the Philippines, where he was decorated with the Philippine Legion of Honor. Pete and Maxine were with the missionaries, amongst the millions who watched as General MacArthur walked down the street with his military personnel. When he noticed Pete, General MacArthur broke rank, stepping out of the procession to greet his old friends.
Then he noticed us and he said, Pete, are these your boys? And Pete said, oh no, these are Mormon missionaries. And General MacArthur said, I've known a lot of good Mormons in my day. In fact, some of my best officers were Mormons.
Countless times, individuals, including general authorities, would ask Maxine why Pete was not a member. She would always tell them to be patient, that he would join the church when he was truly ready, and she was right.
But one day, I remember this so vividly, in the front room, he said to Pete, his son, who was repeat at this point, we were having trouble with Pete, said, Pete, when you're old enough, you can baptize me. Well, Pete was 12 years old. We had that figured out in a hurry. When he was 16, that could happen. So we told President Lee, of course, this going to happen and so forth. So in 4 years, we were in Salt Lake City. So in the morning, we were told to arrive at the tabernacle. I had no idea there was a baptismal font in the tabernacle. And here we arrived, and Pete and Pete changed, and oh, they looked so wonderful in white. Here they were.
Pete Jr. baptized his father, and from that point on, Pete Grimm was a strong and faithful member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a leader, a priesthood holder, and a mighty influence for good.
Sister Grimm was a very important pioneer in the Philippines. She introduced the gospel to the Philippines not as a missionary per se, but by the way that she embraced the Filipino people. You know, if you have the gospel of Jesus Christ, you show it by your devotion to service. And that's what she does. She shared the talent she had, and she just showed how much she loved the Filipino people.
If you write a history of the mission of the church in the Philippines, and you don't include Sister Maxine Grimm, it's not a complete history. You have to have her name in there, up front.
They were absolutely honored and cherished by both the members of the church and by the missionaries. Their impact was immeasurable.
Pete and Maxine remained in the Philippines. Through their efforts, they saw the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints grow and develop. They left a lasting legacy among the missionaries and the members. Their lives, experiences, and personalities continue to bless people today. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths.